The air was thick, heavy, and tasted of rust and fear. Darkness clung to the stone walls like a living thing, whispering secrets that should never be heard. Somewhere in the depths, water dripped slowly, each drop a reminder that time had no mercy here. He awoke with a scream caught in his throat, the cold biting at his skin as iron chains bit into his wrists and ankles. Every muscle in his body screamed to move, to fight, but the chains held him fast. Not just fast, like they were alive, tightening slightly whenever he struggled, as if mocking his futile resistance. The whispers began then. Faint, almost polite at first, like a lover's secret, but underneath them was a darkness older than memory, a voice that knew his sins before he even committed them. "You belong to me," it hissed, low and venomous, curling around his mind like smoke. Panic surged, but even fear felt distant, like a dream he couldn't fully grasp. Outside, faint torchlight flickered over walls slick with blood and grime. Shadows moved in ways that defied physics, stretching too long, bending around corners, vanishing when he turned. Shapes with too many eyes, too many smiles, watching. Waiting. Hungry. And then the realization hit him. The chains weren't just holding him. They were a warning, a seal, and a cage. Something ancient slept beneath the stones, something that should have never been awakened, something that had waited for centuries for him to arrive. And now it was awake. Every heartbeat echoed in the cavern like a death drum. Every breath tasted like ash. He was alone, or so he thought. But the darkness remembered. It always remembers. And tonight, it had chosen him. He didn't scream. There was no point. The darkness was inside him already, curling its icy fingers around his soul. The chains rattled, not from his struggle, but from something moving in the shadows beyond, something that lived in the marrow of fear itself. And somewhere, deep beneath the earth, a voice laughed, a sound older than sin, hungrier than death. "Welcome to the abyss." He lay in the cold, suffocating darkness of the dungeon, chains biting into his skin. And for a moment he thought he was alone, but the shadows were never still. The darkness was alive, it moved, and it breathed, it whispered in voices that were not voices but thoughts that slid into his mind like black snakes. He could not push them away, they coiled around his memories, around his fears. They knew everything, and they were patient as the void, patient as the grave, patient as the thing that waits. Beneath all things the whispers started softly at first like wind over dead leaves, calling his name, calling his sins, calling his regrets, every word a knife, every phrase a promise of pain or power. He could not distinguish one from the other. He shivered as the voice grew louder, darker, more intimate. It spoke of horrors he had never seen, of blood spilled before time, of gods that had never been worshipped by mortals, and of the thing chained beneath the stone that had opened its eyes because of him. The chains rattled and he froze because the sound was not from above or around him, it came from below. It was a growl that shook the very walls, a sound that tasted of iron and fire and ancient hatred. He realized then that the chains had been holding not him but the darkness back, and now it smelled his fear and it hungered for his soul. The whispers became commands, the shadows became fingers reaching from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling, brushing against his skin, brushing against his mind. Reminding him of the blood on his hands, of the lives he had taken, of the faces he had failed to save. The voice promised him strength to break free, to become more than a man, more than a prisoner, more than a mortal creature of flesh. It promised freedom if he gave himself entirely, if he let it in, and a part of him, a part still human, screamed no, screamed yes, screamed in confusion, screamed in despair. But the voice laughed, and it was everywhere and nowhere at once. It was inside him, it was outside him, it was the slow crawl under his skin, the icy touch on his bones. It told him of the arena of fire where men were broken, and of the darkness that watched from every corner of history. It told him that the world was older than gods, older than kings, older than man, and that it had waited for this moment, for him to choose, for him to bend, for him to break. And he felt it moving through his veins, not like blood, like liquid shadow, like black fire burning cold. It whispered promises of vengeance, of strength, of rage, of things no human should ever feel. And the shadows around him began to writhe, forming faces that twisted and melted into one another, smiling, screaming, moaning, calling him to look into their eyes and see the truth. And the truth was unbearable. The truth was that the world was nothing but a playground for those who existed before creation. The truth was that he had never been free. The truth was that the chains had been bait, the darkness had been waiting, and he had taken it. willingly, and now it seeped into his bones and filled his lungs, and every thought in his head was no longer his own, every memory was touched by it, every heartbeat was synchronized with the slow drum of its ancient patience, and then a single voice rose above the others, one that spoke clearly, one that promised everything and demanded everything, one that said, your body, your mind, your soul, they are mine now. And he felt himself bending, he felt himself changing, he felt the fire of power and the cold of death mingling, and he screamed, but it was swallowed by the shadows, by the whispers, by the darkness itself, and the dungeon trembled, and he laughed too, and he cried too, and he felt alive in a way no man ever should, and in the distance he heard the echo of chains breaking, and he knew this was only the beginning, and that the abyss had truly welcomed him, and he would never, ever be alone again. The darkness inside him pulsed and breathed and whispered, and he could no longer tell where he ended, and it began, it coiled around his bones and filled his chest with cold fire, and the chains that had once bound him rattled as if impatient, as if urging him to surrender to the thing that had waited beneath the earth since before men spoke. His thoughts were not his own, his memories twisted into nightmares, and then it spoke louder, sharper, more urgent than ever before, offering him power, freedom, escape from the prison of flesh and the endless torment of iron. If he would only give one drop of blood, one drop of life, one drop of himself, he could rise, he could tear the world open, he could become more than human, more than mortal, more than a creature chained to the whims of fate. He hesitated, and the shadows around him thickened, curling up the walls, coiling at his feet, wrapping around the chains like serpents of smoke. The whispers became laughter, and screams and promises of ruin and glory all at once, and he could feel every heartbeat of the dungeon, every shiver of stone, every vibration of the ancient thing below answering him, daring him, mocking him. And then he pressed his palm to the rusted metal of the chains and cut his hand with the jagged edge of the iron, and the blood spilled onto the stone floor, warm and bright and dark and alive, and the whispers changed immediately into delight, into hunger, into satisfaction, into a voice that slid into his mind like silk and iron together. And it said, finally, 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 and he screamed because he felt the shadows seep into his skin, through the wound, through the blood, through the marrow of his bones, and he felt a fire that was not heat and a cold that was not ice filling him until he was trembling and sobbing and laughing all at once. He wanted to run, but he could not move. He wanted to fight, but he had no strength. The dungeon around him became alive with writhing forms, with screaming faces, with claws and teeth, with eyes that glimmered like dying suns, reaching for him, for the blood, for the life, for the fear, for the thing it had been waiting to claim since the first dawn of time. And he felt it crawling into his mind and whispering secrets about every man who had ever lived, who had ever fallen, who had ever worshipped, who had ever died. And he realized with a sudden sick clarity that he was no longer a man, he was a vessel, a beacon, a key, and the blood he had spilled was the lock turning in its hands. And the thing laughed low and deep and terrible, and it echoed through the stones and his own throat as if he had made the sound himself. And he wanted to close his eyes, but he could not, for the shadows pressed upon his lids, and he saw visions of fire and blood and cities crumbling under unseen hands, and the screams of men who had not yet lived, and the laughter of women who had been forgotten before birth. And he shivered in absolute terror and awe at the same time. And the chains loosened around his wrists as the thing inside him stretched its claws into his chest, and he felt a strength that was unnatural, strength that made his muscles ache and burn and swell. But at the same time his mind twisted with fear, with shame, with memories of sins he could not even recall. And the voice said, you are mine, and you always were, and you will do what I desire. And he bowed to it in the only way he could, with trembling flesh and shivering soul. And the dungeon seemed to breathe with him and around him and under him and over him, and he realized the shadows were not outside any more, they were him, they were inside him, and every heartbeat was shared with the thing that had waited beneath the stones. And he tasted blood in his mouth, and it was not just his own, it was ancient, it was bitter, it was the taste of fear itself. And the dungeon screamed with it, and then silence fell, but it was not peace, it was the quiet of the abyss waiting to surge again. And he knew he had crossed a line from which there was no return. And the thing inside him hummed like a living thing and whispered a final promise into his mind that he could neither refuse nor escape, that he was now bound not by iron but by darkness, and that the world would know his name only after it had learned to fear it. And somewhere in the deepest shadows of the dungeon, the echoes of chains broke once more, and he realized in his soul-shattering terror that this was only the beginning, that every drop of blood, every heartbeat, every scream, every whisper would be claimed by the darkness until he was nothing but a vessel, and the abyss itself had come alive inside him, hungry, patient, relentless, eternal. The chains were gone, but their memory burned into his skin and his soul, and the darkness inside him thrummed with anticipation as if every heartbeat of the dungeon had been leading him here. And then the ground shifted and the walls dissolved into fire and sand and the roar of a crowd that was not human, and yet it was human, and the sun was black and red and the air thick with the iron scent of blood and sweat and fear, and he stumbled forward, unsteady, the shadows writhing along his limbs, stretching and curling with their own hunger, and the arena rose around him, immense ancient circular walls carved with faces frozen in screams, and the seats were filled with figures whose eyes glowed faintly in the firelight, and they watched him with a hunger that made the hair on his arms rise, and he knew instantly that this was no ordinary place. This was not an arena for men, this was a theater for monsters and gods, and those who had walked before men. And he had been chosen to perform in it. The darkness inside him surged and coiled and whispered promises of power, of strength, of freedom from the chains of mortality, and he clenched his fists and felt his veins pulse with a fire that was cold, and his muscles tensed and his mind screamed in terror, because he knew that the crowd would demand blood, and not just the spilling of it, but the spilling of everything he had ever been. And he saw the first opponent emerge from the shadows, another man, another beast, another vessel of something ancient. And his eyes were black pools reflecting the abyss, and he lunged without warning, and the smell of iron and decay filled his nostrils, and the clash of flesh and steel rang in his ears, and he felt himself moving faster than thought and harder than iron, and the darkness guided him, every motion, every strike, every dodge, and yet fear slithered around his mind like a living thing, reminding him that this was a game he could not survive unless he embraced it fully, unless he let the darkness claim him entirely. And with every blow he dealt, he heard the whispers growing louder and the shadows on his skin dancing with delight, and the crowd roared in unholy jubilation as if the entire arena existed to witness the transformation of a man into something else, into something eternal, into something feared. And he realized that the opponent was not alive, really not alive at all, but a projection of the darkness, testing him, teaching him, breaking him, and he felt his own body respond with a strength that was impossible and a speed that was unnatural, and yet his heart raced in terror, because the more he embraced it, the more he understood that he was losing himself and gaining a monster, and every cheer from the unseen crowd was a reminder that this was bigger than him, bigger than life, bigger than death, and he was only beginning to understand the depth of the arena of the damned, where men became weapons and weapons became gods and gods became shadows and shadows became eternal horrors. And he felt a surge of triumph and fear and despair all at once as the sun of fire set behind the walls and the shadows of the crowd stretched to engulf him, and he knew then that the arena would never release him, that he had been marked, that every heartbeat in this place belonged to the darkness that now flowed through his veins, and that the moment he fell or faltered, the abyss would feast upon his soul. And somewhere, deep in the center of the arena, beneath the sand, beneath the fire, beneath the screams, the ancient thing stirred and laughed low and terrible, and he understood in a shiver of pure terror that the arena was alive, the crowd was alive, the darkness was alive, and now, so was he. The arena fell silent for a heartbeat, but it was not peace, it was anticipation, a predator holding its prey in its gaze, and he felt it inside him, the darkness coiling tighter than ever, writhing through his veins, whispering promises and threats in a language older than memory. And then he felt it, a burn beneath his skin, a fire that was not heat, a pressure that was not weight, spreading across his chest, his arms, his face, a slow, creeping sensation like the claws of something unseen, scratching into his very soul. And when he lifted his hand to touch it, the mark flared, glowing faint red beneath his fingers, and the skin around it pulsed as if alive, as if breathing, and he stumbled back in terror, because it was not a mark, it was a mouth, a black mouth with jagged edges and faint whispers crawling out of it into his mind, telling him things he had never known, things he did not want to know, things that made his knees buckle and his teeth grit and his stomach churn. And the crowd, the shadows, the very stones of the arena seemed to lean in closer to watch him break, to watch him succumb, to watch the transformation begin in earnest. And he felt the air around him thicken with the scent of iron and ash and decay, every breath a struggle, every heartbeat a hammer pounding against the fragile walls of his sanity. And the mark spread, climbing up his neck, down his ribs, twisting like a living thing with teeth, eyes, intent, and he screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the shadows, the darkness, the weight pressing down from every angle. And in that scream he realized the truth. The mark was not just on him, it was in him, inside him, entwined with his soul, rewriting the lines between himself and the entity that had claimed him since the first drop of blood, and fear rose like a tidal wave, not just of death but of obliteration, of knowing that he was no longer alone in his body, that something else breathed with him, thought with him, hungered with him, and every thought of escape, every memory of who he had been, every desperate hope was a whisper fading into the roar of the darkness, and when he looked down at his hands, he saw the veins under his skin glowing faintly black, pulsating with intent, and the mark whispered again, this time clearer, colder, sharper. You are mine. You always were. The world will know your fear, your power, your surrender. And soon, it will fear me as it fears you. And in that moment he understood that fear was no longer a warning, it was a companion, it was a chain, it was the very essence of the entity now living in his veins. And he shivered because the arena itself seemed to lean closer, the shadows stretching to touch him, the ground beneath his feet pulsing like a heartbeat that was not his own. And he realized that every eye, every whisper, every flicker of movement was waiting, watching for him to break fully, to give himself completely, and he wanted to run but he could not. He wanted to fight but he was already part of the fight. The darkness, the entity, the mark pulsing through his flesh, and his mind screamed in terror and awe as the whispers grew into a chant, ancient and endless. The mark burning, living, claiming, and he knew with every fiber of his being that the world he had known was gone and the world he was about to inherit was filled with shadows, fire, blood, and the unrelenting eyes of the entity that now shared his body, his soul, his fear, and he fell to his knees, trembling, sobbing, laughing, screaming silently inside because the mark was not just a symbol, it was the key and the lock and the hunger and the promise, and somewhere, in the heart of the arena, the shadows smiled and waited and the darkness inside him whispered, "Rise. Become what you were always meant to be." He fell to the cold stone floor of the arena, trembling, his body quivering from the mark that burned into his flesh and the darkness that throbbed in his veins, and beneath the echoes of the crowd, beneath the shadows that crawled along the walls, beneath the roar of fire and iron, he felt it, a vibration deep in the earth, low and terrible, like a heartbeat older than time, slow, patient, inevitable, and a sick clarity struck him with the force of a falling mountain. The chains had never bound him, they had only kept something else in place, something vast, something ancient, something older than gods, older than men, older than the memory of creation itself, and his blood ran cold as realization crept through him like black ice because every scream he had ever heard, every shadow that had whispered in his mind, every heartbeat of terror, every drop of blood, every ounce of fear had been orchestrated, manipulated, drawn out to awaken the thing beneath the stones, to stir it from its slumber, and he could feel it now, deep beneath the arena, beneath the dungeon, beneath the foundations of the world, a presence like a storm pressing against the crust of reality, pushing upward with patience and rage and hunger, and he knew that it had been waiting for him specifically for centuries, for him to bleed, to fear, to surrender, to become the key, the vessel, the one who would finally release it from its ancient prison, and the shadows around him shifted and writhed in acknowledgement as if the world itself leaned closer to see the moment of awakening, and the darkness inside him shivered and pulsed, whispering secrets in a language older than thought, telling him of civilizations crushed before they even began, of gods who fell and bled into the earth, of men who were nothing but instruments of its patience, and his mind reeled because the truth was unbearable. He had been chosen not as a prisoner but as a herald, not as a victim but as a servant, and the chains, the arena, the mark, the blood, they had all been steps in a path that led directly to it, the entity beneath the chains, the thing older than light, older than hope, and it stirred with every heartbeat of his own, echoing in his veins, in his bones, in his very soul, a vibration that was hunger, that was power, that was inevitability, and he realized that the fear he had felt, the terror he had thought was his alone, was nothing compared to the storm that now pressed against the thin walls of the world, waiting for release, and he saw in his mind's eye the vision of what it could do, what it would do once free, how the skies would burn, how men would scream, how cities would crumble under the weight of its waking, and a cold, sick thrill ran through him even as he shivered with horror because he understood that he was no longer human. Not really, that part of him had already been claimed by it, entwined with it, made one with the darkness, and he wanted to flee, he wanted to fight, he wanted to deny it. But the entity whispered through his veins, soft, patient, cruel, saying, "You will not leave. You were never meant to leave. You are mine, and I am awakening through you." And the arena around him seemed to pulse with that knowledge, the shadows stretching long and thin like the fingers of a god reaching through the stones, and he realized with the deepest, most absolute terror that the chains had not held him, they had held the world back, and now the world was exposed, and the first stirrings of the ancient thing beneath the chains pressed upward through the earth, through the arena, through his very body, and he screamed silently, for the darkness inside him was alive, patient, eternal, and it whispered, "Prepare, for the abyss has finally begun to rise, and you will be its witness, its servant, and its herald." The darkness inside him pulsed with a life of its own, coiling through his veins and bones like molten shadow, and he felt it tightening, pressing, demanding obedience, and he stumbled through the arena, his limbs heavy with dread, each step a struggle against the will that was no longer entirely his, and the crowd, the shadows, the fire, the whispers, they all leaned closer, hungry, anticipating, and he understood in a single, gut-twisting instant that this was the trial, the breaking, the crucible that would strip him of flesh and will alike. And a searing pain shot through his shoulders as the mark flared brighter, black tendrils slicing into his skin, burrowing into his muscles, entwining with nerves and sinew until every fiber of his body screamed in terror and agony, and yet he could not scream aloud for the shadows swallowed sound, the darkness devoured noise, and every breath he drew was thick with the iron scent of his own fear, and the whispers became commands, sharp, jagged, slicing through thought. "Give yourself. Submit. Yield. Become nothing and everything." And the chains of his mind, the last vestiges of his will, began to crack, snapping under the pressure of the entity within, snapping under the weight of the ancient hunger, and he fell to his knees, trembling, sobbing, muscles spasming, as visions erupted behind his eyes, visions of flesh tearing, of men screaming in agony, of cities burning, of the world reduced to ash and shadow. And he realized with abject terror that the entity did not merely hunger for obedience, it hungered for annihilation, for assimilation, for the complete surrender of his humanity, and every instinct screamed to fight, to claw, to flee, but every ounce of his strength was drowned in black fire that was cold and living and whispered of eternity and inevitability, and he felt the shadows crawling beneath his skin, over his bones, in his marrow, pulling, twisting, testing. And the first crack in his mind gave way with a sensation like being torn apart from the inside out, and the darkness roared in triumph, filling his veins with the taste of ash and iron, filling his heart with anticipation and fear and sick exultation, and he heard the distant, impossible laughter of the entity that had waited beneath the chains for centuries, echoing through the stones, through the air, through his very soul, and he knew he was being remade, reshaped, reformed into something both terrifying and inevitable, and the whispers pressed closer, now 1,000 voices, all chanting, all demanding, all promising, and the arena itself seemed to pulse with the rhythm of breaking flesh and will, with the screams of men and gods and shadows that had walked the earth long before humanity and long after would crumble, and he felt his own screams clawing silently at his throat, strangled by fear, swallowed by darkness, and he realized, with the deepest, most absolute horror, that this breaking was not a punishment. It was the birth of a new instrument, a new herald, a new vessel, and his body shook, and his mind shattered, and a laugh bubbled from somewhere deep in his chest, not his own, jagged, cruel, triumphant, and the mark on his skin writhed, glowing black, alive, feeding, claiming, and the entity whispered one final promise into his marrow, into his blood, into every atom of him: "You are no longer man. You are nothing and everything. You are mine. And through you, the world will know fear." The arena had fallen silent, but it was not peace, it was anticipation, it was the breath of the void pressing against the world, and he felt it inside him, the darkness that had once whispered now roaring through every vein, every nerve, every broken fragment of his mind, and the mark glowed black like molten shadow across his chest, pulsing in rhythm with the heartbeat of something ancient, something patient, something that had waited for eons beneath stone, beneath iron, beneath humanity itself. And the ground trembled as the arena itself seemed to stretch and warp, walls bending impossibly, fire bending in the air like liquid, shadows crawling and writhing, reaching, and he understood with bone-deep clarity that this was no longer a place of men, this was the domain of something eternal, and he was its herald, its vessel, its god, bound in flesh and fear, and he rose to his feet, limbs trembling, muscles coiled with power that was not entirely his, strength that was not human, and every step he took reverberated like thunder, and the whispers, the shadows, the audience of unseen eyes, they all leaned closer, hungry, anticipating, and the entity inside him spoke directly, clearly, in a voice that was both his and impossibly not his. Rise. Become. Let the world know me through you. Let them scream your name and mine. And he felt the last threads of his humanity unraveling as the black fire of the abyss coursed through his veins, filling his heart, his mind, his bones, and the mark burned hotter, spreading tendrils of living shadow up his arms, over his neck, into his skull, and he screamed, not in pain, not in terror, but in the raw exultation of transformation, and the shadows of the arena bent toward him, writhing, joining, feeding, merging with the black fire that poured from his flesh, and the first tremors of the bound god rose through the earth, the stones of the arena cracking under the weight of awakening, pillars splintering, fire roaring, wind howling, and he saw it, beyond the smoke and shadow, a vision of what he had become, a god bound by flesh, yet unchained in power, a living nightmare, an apex of fear and wrath, and the whispers now were 1,000 voices, a chorus of terror, singing his name, screaming his name. He is risen. He is ours. He is the bound god. The sky above rippled, black and red, and stars blinked out one by one as if the heavens themselves feared what had been unleashed, and every being in the arena, every shadow, every echo, every whisper bent toward him, feeding, amplifying, celebrating the rise of something no man should witness, and the darkness inside him surged further, coiling, thrashing, claiming, and he felt every heartbeat of the entity in sync with his own, every nerve igniting with power and dread, and the ground beneath. His feet pulsed with the rhythm of ancient wrath, the chains of reality rattling, the walls of the arena groaning under the pressure of creation itself bending to the will of the bound god, and he reached his hands outward, and shadows leapt from the stones, from the air, from the earth itself, writhing, twisting, forming faces, claws, teeth, eyes, screams, and they obeyed, and the entity laughed low and terrible, reverberating through his bones, through the arena, through the world, and he knew that he was no longer just a man, no longer just a vessel, he was the bound god risen, and the world below would tremble at the sound of his name, and the whispers rose into a roar, deafening, endless, and he felt the last pieces of fear, of doubt, of humanity, crumble and fall away, and he smiled, a thing both terrible and magnificent, and the arena erupted into shadows, fire, and screams, and the earth itself shivered as the bound god fully awakened, and the darkness inside him whispered one final promise that echoed into eternity: all that lives shall tremble, all that breathes shall fall. I am risen. I am the bound. I am eternal. The world trembled beneath him, but it was not the tremor of an earthquake, it was the pulse of the abyss itself, beating through his veins, through his flesh, through the very marrow of the earth, and he stood at the apex of what had been built, what had been chained, what had been whispered into existence for eons, and the bound god inside him roared with triumph, a sound that was neither human nor divine but the echo of something eternal and terrible, and every shadow, every scream, every fire and stone bowed, shifted, and twisted in obedience, and he realized with the deepest, most absolute terror that there was no returning, no salvation, no mercy, only the final truth, the truth that had been whispered in every drop of blood, in every crack of stone, in every agonized heartbeat along the path he had walked. The world was not his own, never had been and never would be, And he was never truly alone because the entity that had risen within him had always been patient, always watching, always waiting, always hungry, and the mark across his chest pulsed in rhythm with its heartbeat, glowing with a black fire that seared reality itself, and the whispers surged into a deafening chorus, each voice a lifetime of horrors, secrets, sins, and screams, and he understood that the arena, the chains, the blood, the fear, every moment of agony had been preparation, refinement, awakening, and now it was complete, and the world would know its master, the bound God risen, the vessel unbroken, the darkness made flesh, and he felt the abyss press through him, through the ground, through the air, twisting the sky into impossible shapes, and the wind carried screams from cities that had not yet been, from men who would never live, from gods who had long been forgotten, and he laughed. But it was not his laughter, it was the laughter of eternity itself, cruel, patient, unstoppable, and he raised his arms, and shadows spilled from his fingertips, forming wings, claws, eyes, mouths that whispered madness into the minds of men, and he felt the power of centuries, of eons, of the first blood spilled in sacrifice to awaken him, coursing through every fiber of his being, making flesh shiver and bones ache with both terror and exultation, and the final truth settled upon him like a crown of fire and shadow. Fear is eternal, power is absolute, and death is only the beginning, and he would rise through both, and the world, the universe, the very threads of creation, would bend, break, and kneel before the bound God that he had become, and the abyss inside him whispered once more, soft and infinite, all that was, all that is, all that shall be belongs to me. Witness it, fear it, and remember that nothing can ever unmake this truth. I am eternal. I am the bound. I am the darkness that waits in all things. And with that, the shadows erupted outward like a tidal wave of night, swallowing cities, forests, seas, skies, and every scream echoed across reality, every whisper became a chant of fear, and the bound God rose fully, an unstoppable force, eternal and infinite, and the final truth was written across the bones of the world. There is no escape from what waits beneath, within and beyond, and all that men hold dear is but a prelude to the abyss that now walks the earth through him.